giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. And not just that, but the entire idea and the fundamentals of the Torah, as well as its commentary, as well as its esoteric and mysticism, as well as all of the lessons of the Torah that were revealed much later on, were all given to Moshe at Mount Sinai. And we're going to learn some interesting principles from a very obscure source in the Torah about how we're supposed to understand things that may not be relevant today. One of the biggest questions that, or one of the biggest debates or arguments or conversations that go on about the Torah is how relevant is everything in the Torah to today's day, right? So there are certain mitzvahs that we know we can't do because, for example, we don't have a holy temple, so we can't do them without a holy temple. Or we can't achieve the purity that we were able to achieve during the temple times with the red heifer, and so on. There are many areas of the Torah that are not applicable just because we cannot perform those mitzvahs at this time. However, we believe in the validity and the timelessness of those mitzvahs. But what happens when there's something, whether it's a mitzvah, whether it's a commentary, whether it's something in the Torah, specifically in the oral narration of the Torah, that seems somewhat irrelevant to today? How are we supposed to approach that? Does the Torah lend itself to human error? Does the Torah lend itself to human time limitations? So, for example, as a human being, even with science and even with every other type of study, it's all based on what we know now, right? So whatever we know about space now, whatever we know about astrology, astronomy, and everything else that we have, through the gift of science, is based on what we know now. We know and assume correctly that in 50 years or in 100 years, they're going to be much more advanced and they're going to know a lot more than we know now. So what we know now may be irrelevant to what we know in 100 years because of the advancements. And that's something that goes with the territory of secular studies. But when it comes to the Torah, which is given by God, God is timeless, God is infinite. So how do we approach parts of the Torah that make us question, is this still relevant to today? So that's what we're going to tackle tonight. So what I want to start with, and this is the fundamental point of the class. This is basically I guess this is, I'm going to come to the conclusion immediately, but this is what is the basis of our belief. This is the basis of how we approach Torah. I understand that there are many who disagree, but this is written by Maimonides, and it's based on the core principles of how we view the Torah. So what does he write? And this is the Rambam, which he writes the principles of Torah. He writes this in his Mishnah Torah, in his book of Jewish law, but he also writes this in his commentary on the Mishnayos. And here's very clearly what he says. The ninth foundation, and he has several foundations, but this is the ninth principle of Torah study, as well as the core values of Torah. The Torah of Moshe will never be rewritten or exchanged, and God will never give us a different Torah. The Torah that we have is the Torah, and it's never going to be changed. We cannot add to it or detract from it. It's written from form or oral tradition. As the Torah states, do not add and do not detract from it, as it states in Deuteronomy. Now, the Rambam is making it very clear in this section that the written Torah, meaning the Torah of Moshe, is completely unchangeable. You can't add to it. You can't deduct from it. The Torah is timeless and it will never change. This is not just a temporary a guide until we have the new one. Even when Mashiach comes and we have the revelation of Mashiach, we have the revelation of Torah from Mashiach, we're still it's all going to be based on the core of the Torah of Moshe. This Torah is our Torah, and it's never going to change. So having said that principle, let us tackle the bigger question, which is going to be the somewhat of the gray area, which is, what about the oral narration of the Torah? What I'm going to share now is a very core principle of how we view the Torah. And I say how we view the Torah. This is, you could ascribe it however you want in terms of Chabad or in terms of Orthodoxy, but I'm giving you my perspective, the perspective that I was raised, the perspective of how we see the Torah. And I'm going to do it as best as I can. I cannot speak for other opinions, but I am speaking for the core values of how we see the Torah. So The oral narration of Torah, according to our opinion, was given to Moshe at Mount Sinai. Everything that's in the Talmud and everything that is in the Midrash, which is the lessons and the stories and all of the background and context and everything else, mostly the lessons, as well as the Kabbalah, the esoteric secrets of the Torah, as well as the Remedies, which is more of like the codes of the Torah, like Gematria or other codes, were all given to Moshe at Mount Sinai, to the point that anything that was ever revealed about the Torah in the oral narration was already given to Moshe at Mount Sinai, and it was part of the process that Hashem wanted, is that the sages, the rabbis, the great, not the rabbis like us, but the great rabbis, the ones that were holy and pure, the ones that were that were ordained in the chain of Moshe Rabbeinu, were given the divine inspiration to be able to help reveal with their human intellect to reveal the oral narration of the Torah, but its core was already given to Moshe at Mount Sinai. So everything that we consider to be holy was given to Mount Sinai. So when we study the Talmud, or when we study Rashi, or when we study the Code of Jewish Law, or when we study Maimonides, or if we study the text of the Torah itself, to us it's all the same. To us, in a sense, the holiness of it is all coming from God. It was all given to God at Mount Sinai. And these individuals, like the Rambam and Rashi and the Ramban and all these other individuals, were all because of their great stature and because of their surrender to God and their surrender to be a righteous person, completely selfless and completely holy. They merited to reveal what was already given to Moshe at Mount Sinai. That's how we see the oral narration of the Torah, which means when we study a piece of the Talmud, like we have on the screen here, to us this is not just some rabbi musing in a house of study and just sharing his own random thoughts. This is actually holy words that were given to Moshe at Mount Sinai and are being revealed through this stage. I want to also reiterate that these individuals, especially the ones that are in the Talmud, they all received smicha, the rabbinical ordination, going back to the chain of Moshe. And in order to receive that level of smicha, they had to be perfect. They had to be on a level of character. They had to know all 70 languages of the world. They had to know the entire Torah, all 4 parts of the Torah, the pshat, the simple explanation, the remez, which is the codes, the medrash, which are the lessons, and the Kabbalah and the yesod, which is the deeper secrets, the esoteric. They had to know everything, and only then, and if their teachers felt they were worthy, were they given smicha. It was a very difficult, and the reason why smicha ended, the reason why the chain going back to Moshe ended, is because there was nobody at the time worthy of receiving that smicha. It was very difficult to achieve. So these are not ordinary people. So they merited to reveal what God shared with Moshe already, but they were revealing it in their own, through their own intellect, and that's what we have in cases like this. So whether we're studying the Rambam, now yes, the Rambam and Rashi and others were not part of that chain. However, we believe that because they were righteous individuals, they merited the divine inspiration to share the commentary on the Torah as well. But putting that aside for a second, so now that if we approach the oral Torah, the oral narration of Torah, such as the halacha, the Talmud, and all these other things as holy, as part of God, what do we do with things that are obviously not relevant to today? And here's the example. This is from the Talmud, the Tractate of Shabbat. I'm going to read it because it's actually so obscure. It's so ridiculous in a sense that what do we do about this? So what is Yoezer? There's an entire section in the Tractate of Shabbat that deals with remedies, health remedies. I remember learning this when I was in yeshiva, and I didn't understand a word of it. So it's actually funny that we're doing this tonight, because it's like bringing back those memories. So what is Yoezer? A vegetable known as putnak. I have no idea what that is. For what purpose is it eaten? To cure liver worms. With what is it eaten? With 7 white dates. But what if you don't have that? Well, if this option is not available, so then you're supposed to eat white cress. If this option is not available, place fatty meat on coals and suck on the bone while fasting, and then drink vinegar. However, some maintain that vinegar is bad for the liver and should be avoided. If this option is not available, scrape the dust from a thorn bush, scrape it top to bottom rather than bottom to top, lest the worms emerge through the mouth. At twilight, boil the dust in beer. The next day, close your nostrils and drink it. And there are many, many such remedies, by the way, that are in the Talmud. Some of them actually do make sense. For example, eating beets is one of them. Eating beets for calming your body down, or eating mint to cool your body down, which I think has been proven. But there are also many remedies like this, which is completely unproven by science, still unproven, and even the Torah itself, as you'll see, says that this hasn't worked for anyone. So, what do we do about this? If this is being given to us as a medical remedy, right? And we obviously don't don't see it work. So does that mean the Torah is no longer applicable to us? No, that this at least this part of Torah no longer applicable to us. So what we're going to do now is we're going to deviate a little bit to talk about the approach that we have to the oral Torah, and to things that seem irrelevant, and how we're supposed to deal with them. So the Rambam interestingly writes that certain parts of the Torah were actually not necessarily divine, and they were added in because they had relevance to its time, but we should not take it as divine inspiration. And there are those that argue, and we're going to go through the different opinions. So the Rambam says like this. One second, I just want to move my So the Rambam writes, "Do not ask me to reconcile everything the sages said regarding astronomy with the ways things are in real life, because the mathematics, including astronomy, of those times was flawed. They did not address these matters as received traditions from the prophets, but rather as the knowledge of the scholars of their generations in these fields, or as ideas they heard from sages of their time." So what the Rambam is saying here, and this is not in the book of Halacha, in this book of the Rambam, this is the Guide for the Perplexed. It's a book of philosophy that the Rambam wrote. It's important to mention that because the Rambam was writing this more of as a I don't know what the right word here, but basically like as a bonus book for those who were interested in philosophy, and that they should get their philosophy from a Torah source, versus the alternative. But he's writing over here is that there were areas that the sages talked about that were only relevant to their times based on the knowledge that they had available, but it was not related to the divine inspiration that they received to share Torah knowledge. In other words, when they were talking about Jewish law, when they were talking about Jewish concepts and Torah concepts, so then it was with divine inspiration. But these ideas, these secular ideas, or these seemingly random ideas, were more about the time that they were in, and they're not relevant to today. Now, there are those that disagree, because there are many sages that believe that every single word, whether if it's included, the Rav Ashi, one of the last sages of the Talmud that composed and compiled the Talmud, was very selective about what he included. In fact, it says that the angel of death approached Rav Ashi, and told him his time has come. And Rav Ashi says, "Wait, I need another 30 days to review the Talmud one more time to make sure that I included everything that needs to be included and excluded everything that has to be excluded." In other words, every part of the Talmud was carefully selected by Rav Ashi to be, to be part of it, which means that there is a divine reason for everything to be included. And that goes for every other part of the Torah as well that was divinely inspired. So that being the case, there are those that disagree with the Rambam in this case, saying that every single word of a holy book is holy. In other words, either a book is holy or it's not holy. So I'm going to give you an example. There's a very famous historical book called Josephus, right? Josephus was one of the generals of the Jewish military of the Zealots by the Second Temple when the Romans were besieging Jerusalem and eventually destroyed the Second Temple. And he I don't know what's wrong with my vocabulary today. He defected over to the Romans. However, he wrote a historical book about the entire siege and the destruction of the Second Temple, and he was extremely accurate. He was non-biased at all. If you read it, you know what I'm talking about. He wrote the facts down. Even though the Jews considered him a traitor, or at least the Zealots considered him a traitor, he wrote this perfectly accurate book of history, to the point that the sages quote Josephus. Rashi himself quotes Josephus several times as a source of what happened during the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, the book of Josephus is 100% accurate. However, it's not a holy book. It's a book of history. It's not holy, which means that it's not a book that you can't put on the floor. It's not a book that you can't read in the bathroom. It's not a holy book. It's 100% accurate, but it's not a holy book. There are certain, but a book of the Torah, take a book of Medrash or a book of Rashi or a book of anything that's considered to be Torah or holy, is a holy book and it has to be treated with respect. We don't throw it out. We don't read it in the bathroom. We don't desecrate it. It's a holy book. So if it's a holy book, that means everything that's in the book has to be considered holy. And those opinions disagree on the Rambam, and if it's because Rav Ashi included it, means that it's holy. And here's one of those opinions. This is Rabbeinu Bachya, and he writes that our sacred Torah is bound to God, God's supernal wisdom, and all of the wisdoms that are included in it. In other words, everything, even including secular knowledge, is included in the Torah. In other words, secular science and many of these other things are hidden in the Torah. That if you study the Torah and its commentary and everything as well, you will also gain the knowledge, the secular knowledge, because it's also hidden in there. The Rogatchover Goen, who was more of a recent scholar, and he was actually the Rebbe's teacher. He gave the Rebbe, based on what we know, he gave the Rebbe smicha. But he was just a brilliant person. When he met Albert Einstein, Einstein said that had he joined him in secular studies, there would have been two Einsteins. He was brilliant. He knew the entire Talmud by heart. That's just a side thing. I mean, he was one of the most brilliant scholars of his time. But he writes also, now the healing remedies mentioned in the Talmud are categorized as part of the oral Torah that was transmitted to us from Mount Sinai. So he's taking the opinion of those who say that even things that seem mundane are considered to be holy and part of the Torah, and they were given to Moshe at Mount Sinai. And why does that matter? Because if it was given to Moshe at Mount Sinai, it means that it's timeless, and it doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't limit itself to finite things such as time or place, and it is part of the essence of the Torah that God has given us. So now, and here's another quote from the Ramah. The Ramah was the co-author of the Shulchan Aruch, co-author of the Code of Jewish Law. He also wrote the Beis Yosef, who was writing from a Sephardic point of view, wrote the Code of Jewish Law based on the Sephardic halachic opinions. And the Ramesh Israel, who has lived in Krakow, was writing the Ashkenazic Code of Jewish Law, but Beis Yosef beat him. In fact, if you go to the city of Tzfat, I'm sorry, I'm deviating here, but if you go to the city of Tzfat, where you could go to the synagogue where Rav Yosef Karo, the Beis Yosef, who wrote the Code of Jewish Law, studied. So there's a room in there that they tell you this is where the Beis Yosef learned from a Magid, from an angel. And there's a book called Magid Meisharim, where he records all the conversations that he had with this Magid. And one of the things the Magid told him, this angel told him, is that there's another very smart person. There's another guy, and there's another holy person who's also writing a book of Code of Jewish Law. So you better hurry up and beat him. And he actually did. The Code of Jewish Law came out first. So when the Ramah heard about this, he altered his book to be what's called, the Shulchan Aruch means a set table. What we call the Code of Jewish Law in Hebrew is a Shulchan Aruch, and it means a set table, which means that it's basically the Jewish law presented to you in the most simple form. So what the Ramah did was he wrote what's called the Mappa, which means a tablecloth, and he basically added inserts into the Code of Jewish Law, and by doing that, the Code of Jewish Law became accepted by both the Sephardic and Ashkenazic communities. And this is about in the 1500s, by the way. So that being said, this is a quote from the Ramah. Many wondered about this because experience shows that these remedies are ineffective. So he's basically, in reality, he's testifying to the fact that that these remedies that the Talmud talks about are ineffective. However, we must say that the nature of these things have changed since the Talmudic era, and this is the case with multiple subjects of Torah. So the Ramah, being a man of halacha, of Jewish law, he's focused on the reality of the world, and if the world proves to you this doesn't work, there must be something that's not necessarily relevant to today. At least from a first glance approach. He's not saying that's the case. He's saying based on the initial approach that you see it. So now, here's what we're going to do to answer the question. And here's what the Rebbe is going to do, because this is a talk from the Rebbe. We're going to get a little Kabbalistic now, but bear with me because this is very important. Everything that exists in this world, as we've talked many times, has a spiritual counterpart in the spiritual worlds above. In fact, everything that we have in this world its source is in a spiritual world. First, God created the spiritual worlds, where he created everything that will eventually become what we know as the physical world. And our physical world is a mirror that flows from its spiritual counterpart. So everything that we have in this world exists in the spiritual world. An example of this is the Holy Temple. We're told that the third temple is already built in the spiritual worlds, and our job is to draw it down into reality, into the physical world. Very often when a righteous person gives a blessing to someone else and the blessing comes true, it's not that that person made the blessing come out of thin air. The blessing existed. So, for example, if a Rebbe would give a blessing to someone, they should be wealthy, or a Rebbe gives a blessing to someone, they should be healthy. The blessing existed in the spiritual realm, but by giving the blessing, the word blessing, Baruch, means to draw down. You're drawing down the existing blessing into the reality of the world, so the world so it could actually be visible. When we daven for somebody who is ill, and we talked about this many times, if we daven for somebody who is ill, so we're not telling God this person is ill, please heal them. God obviously knows this person is ill. What are we trying to do? In the spiritual worlds, there's no such thing as illness. Illness is a sign of disconnection between the spiritual world and this world. Because illness means that there's a gap. There's some sort of disconnect of spiritual energy coming into this world. So by davening for that person, we're trying to draw down that spiritual energy to fill the gap, to be able to heal that person, so the illness will have no place and go away. So the relationship between this physical world and the spiritual world is very, very important. And the spiritual world means godliness, obviously. Spiritual is God. This world is obviously God as well, but it's about what's revealed. So obviously God is everywhere, God is everything. But the question is, do we have that revelation of godliness? Do we see it and do we feel it? I'm going to give you a quick story that illustrates this. So there was a great Rebbe known as Reb Zusha of Anapoli. He was a very humble man, but he was also a very special man, a holy man. And there was once a individual who was very, very poor and had a very difficult time providing for his family. His business was very, very, like, he had an inn in those days. It's only one of the only professions in Europe somebody could have, a Jew could have. So, and it was very difficult for this individual. To make a long story short, he came to Reb Zusha to ask for a blessing that his livelihood should start looking up. And Reb Zusha looked at him and told him, "I want you to go pledge an enormous amount of money to charity." And he told him which charity to pledge it to, amount of money that this person never could even dream of having. And this man looked at Reb Zusha and says, "How am I supposed to get it?" And Reb Zusha said, "God will help you. But if you pledge this amount to charity, that will be that will draw down your blessing that you need." So for the first, now this person was not a materialistic person, this individual. He never really wanted wealth or anything. He just wanted to provide for his family. He wasn't looking to be wealthy. So he never really prayed for wealth. He was more, or prayed for, anything like that. It was more that he just wanted to feed his family. So, but now that Reb Zusha asked him to pledge this enormous amount of money to this charity, he finally went to the synagogue and he just started praying and crying and begging God to help him find a way to be able to make do on his pledge. A few weeks later, there was always battles in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and one of the armies, I don't know if it was the Russian army, the Polish army, or it was after the Cossacks, so I think it was the Polish army. They would come to they came to his village, and the way it would work is they would come and they would basically decide which houses they want to stay in, and they would just stay in those houses and they would eat whatever they wanted, and when they would leave, they would leave. So a few soldiers chose his house. And they stayed in his house for a few days, and he had no choice. He tried to feed them whenever he could feed them, but whatever. And then finally, when the soldiers left, they were gone, and this individual went into the room where they were sleeping, and he found a chest full of gold coins. So he immediately got very nervous, because if they find these gold coins from the army, as if he's stealing from the army, he'll be killed. So he runs to find the soldiers, and he can't find them. He's running and running, and he finally finds anyone from the army, and he goes and says, they left a chest of gold coins in my house. They need to take it. And the commander who they came to finally said, "We never had a chest of gold coins. There was never a chest of gold coins. What are you talking about? You crazy Jew. Go back home. Like, I don't know what you're talking about." And so he went to Reb Zusha, and went to his Rebbe Reb Zusha to ask him what he should do. And when he came to Reb Zusha smiled at him and said, the blessing was fulfilled. And he explained. He said, in heaven, there was a blessing waiting for you for wealth, that you should be wealthy. But you never prayed for wealth. In other words, you never because you never wanted it. So when you came to me to to ask for a blessing, I made you pledge this large amount of money, so you should finally pray for wealth. And now that blessing was fulfilled in reality. So in other words, the blessing existed in the spiritual worlds, but it needed a conduit or a vehicle or it needed a vessel to be able to draw down into reality. So very often there are things in the spiritual realm that don't manifest in reality. So for example, when the world was holier and godliness was more revealed, there were heavenly voices called the Baskel that would come out. A lot more prophecy and things would happen because the world was more holy and spiritual. There was a lot more connection between the spiritual worlds above and the physical reality below. But as the world becomes more and more materialistic and more distant, and godliness becomes less and less revealed, so that connection becomes less and less apparent between the spiritual worlds and the material worlds. And here's an example of that. This is the beginning. Sorry, this is a verse from Deuteronomy, but we're going to explain what this means. From the heavens, he let you hear his great voice to instruct you, and earth has showed you his great fire, and his words you heard from within the flame. So this is actually a hint to the two spiritual worlds. From the heavens, he let you hear means that the world was already in existence of a spiritual world, and the physical world is the way it manifests in reality. And the Rebbe is going to explain here now in a beautiful way to understand that, the connection between the spiritual world and the physical world. Here's what he says. Our ancestors made 42 journeys from Egypt to Israel. In other words, there are 42 stops. These 42 journeys correspond to another set of journeys they made in the heavenly sphere, the source from which all existence emerges. In other words, the spiritual worlds where everything already happens and exists already. So they were basically following that same path that already existed in the spiritual worlds. These spiritual journeys led their souls to the supernal Israel and to Jerusalem perched in the celestial sphere. In other words, there's a Jerusalem above, there's a spiritual Jerusalem, a spiritual Israel. And in order to have that manifest in reality, they had to connect to it in in the spiritual realm, which is why they needed to have the 40 years. And only then were they able to actually draw it down into reality. And even then, it took many years, a couple hundred years, till King David was able to go to Jerusalem and actually live in the city of Jerusalem for the first time as his kingdom. It wasn't until King David that Jerusalem was the capital. It was Shiloh. It was because of the covenant that Abraham made with Avimelech. So Jerusalem was off limits until King David was able to undo it, and only then were they able to live in Jerusalem. So it was a spiritual journey. It was a spiritual connection of bringing down Jerusalem from above into Jerusalem below. So this is why the Torah states, and Moshe wrote their departures according to the journeys as Hashem instructed. What does that mean, that as Hashem instructed? The passage was written first and foremost to explain that our ancestors' heavenly journey were in perfect concert and the actual cause of their earthly journeys. In other words, Moshe knew the route. He led it. He knew exactly where they were. So what does it mean he had to write it down the way God commanded or instructed? Because it already existed in spiritual realm, and Moshe was just following those journeys based on what already existed. So the Torah goes on to state, and these were their journeys according to their departures. This tells us that our ancestors were aware of these dual journeys, and directed their physical journey to be in perfect alignment with and precise replicas of their spiritual journeys. So this tells us, by the way, that the generation that were of Israelites that were in the desert were not just regular, were not just regular Tom, Dick, and Harrys. They were the real deal. They knew exactly what was going on in the spiritual worlds, even though it seemed sometimes that they were complainers and they were sinners or whatever it was. Those were all beyond our comprehension. They were well in tune and in sync with what was going on in the spiritual worlds. So now, this is a beautiful and delightful explanation why the Torah doubles its words, but in reverse order. This lesson applies to the entire Torah. The Torah addresses itself primarily to the supernal sphere and alludes secondarily to the lower sphere. So this is the key here. So what the Rebbe is saying here, this last text is from the Rebbe, by the way. I'm sorry that I said that it's not. So correct, I stand corrected. That it's quoted by the Rebbe as part of his talk, but this quote is not from the Rebbe. But what he's saying here is that when the Torah talks about what happened, the journey of the Jewish people, or the Torah talks about anything, or even about the kosher laws, or the Torah talks about, for example, the kosher laws is a good example. The Torah, it's not that there were animals that were created and the Torah has to tell us and decide which are kosher, which are not. The Torah, first in the spiritual worlds, it was decided that these animals will be able to eat, and these were not, and therefore we need to create those animals. In other words, it was already predetermined what is kosher, what is not kosher, and only then was it created in reality. And the same goes for everything in the Torah. Is that the Torah was speaking from the spiritual, what was existence in the spiritual realm, and through the Torah, writing it down, through the Torah talking about it, it brought it down into reality. As it says, the Torah was the blueprint for the creation of the world, which means the Torah was, for example, it says, honor your father and mother. Therefore, we have to have a father and mother. The Torah was dictating from the spiritual worlds what has to happen in the physical reality. So that being said, now we could try to explain what was going on with the remedies, or things that seem somewhat limited to time. So let's see an example. Tefillin is a very good mitzvah. It's a very interesting mitzvah that shows us this example. Because what does it say in our tefillin, in the tefillin that we have? It says the Shema. Hero, it has more than that, but it says, Hero Israel, the Lord is Hashem, our God. Elokeinu, the Lord is our strength. The Lord is everything to us, and the Lord is one. And then you have, all the mitzvos that we have to do to love Hashem, and many other verses as such, where we can pledge our commitment to Hashem. That's why we put it on our hand, which is connecting it to our heart, binding our heart. We put it on our head to bind our mind and connect our intellect and our emotions to Hashem, and that we should be committed to following Hashem's ways, right? That's what's in our tefillin. Rav Nachman, the son of Yitzchak, here is on the text from the Talmud of Brachos, asks, Abichia, the son of Avin, which passage is inscribed in the tefillin that Hashem wears? Because Hashem wears tefillin too. In fact, it says that when Hashem showed Moshe his presence, it says that he showed him the back knot of his tefillin. Obviously, that's beyond what we can understand, because Hashem doesn't have a physical form. The idea of the knot is the connection, and that the connection can never be unbroken. But from here, we know that Hashem wears tefillin. So what does it say in Hashem's tefillin? Rabbi Chia answers, who is like your nation, Mika Amcha Yisrael? Who is like the nation of Israel? A singular nation on earth. And what does it mean? That Hashem says, the Holy One, blessed be He, says to the Jews, you made me singular in all of existence. In other words, you committed to recognizing God as the only existence on earth. I will do the same for you. You made me singular in all of existence. As it is written, Hero Israel, Hashem is our God, Hashem is one. So I will make you singular in all existence, as is written, who is like you, your nation of Israel, a singular nation on earth. So it's a reciprocation of Hashem's approach to love for us and our love for Hashem. But really what it is it's a connection between the spiritual world and the physical world. Because we're living in the reality. So for us, we're doing a mitzvah, taking the reality of our world, the reality of our materialism, and we're connecting it to Hashem, connecting it to God. And what God is doing is He's drawing down from the spiritual energy, the spiritual worlds, and bringing it down to us in reality. So a mitzvah connects the spiritual world with the physical world. And the more mitzvahs that we do, the more in sync the spiritual world and the physical world becomes, which is why the more mitzvahs that we do will ultimately bring about Mashiach's coming, the arrival of Mashiach, which is the ultimate unification of the spiritual and the physical world. So now that we know this, let's go back to the remedies of the Talmud. So before we go further, I want to just go straight to the question about the medical remedies. So the Rebbe is going to explain towards the end of this class that the remedies that the Talmud talks about actually do exist in the spiritual realm. In other words, all those plants and all those things exist spiritually too. And in the spiritual world, they actually work as a remedy, whatever that means in the spiritual worlds. The problem is that, and then in the times of the Talmud, it actually did work physically as well, because the spiritual and the physical world were more in sync. Why doesn't it work now? Because our worlds are more distant, and there's more disconnect, there's more gaps, less revelation. So therefore, it still exists in the spiritual world, it just doesn't exist in our physical world. So the Torah is still timeless. The medical remedies that are not relevant to today are still timeless. It's just that it's true in the spiritual and not necessarily in the physical. And the Rebbe Rashab, this is the fifth Chabad Rebbe, he writes over here another example about the 600,000 Jews. The Torah mentions several times that there were 600,000 Jews that left Egypt, and that they represent the totality of the Jewish people. So he asks like this, why does the Torah list the numbers of Jews at the time of the Exodus? There were 600,000 Jews. but the numbers have since increased. For example, there were many, many more Jews in the days of King David. Some say there were millions, and like whatever, much crazy numbers. Later, when the temple was built, especially during the second temple, the number was multiplied many times over, as described in the Medrash. So why is this ancient number relevant? In other words, why do we have to keep stressing the 600,000 if there's so many millions if the Torah is timeless and the Torah is eternal, why is that number relevant if it's not going to stay that number? If the Torah is an eternal document, why does it contain a number from the past? Moreover, we are required to read this number repeatedly every year. So the Rebbe Rashav answers, the answer is that number represents the root souls in heaven. That the root souls of 600,000 is what exists in the heaven. And those root souls in Kabbalah teaches us that a soul, just like a flame, could light many candles. A soul could create many different souls. So while there are millions and millions of people and millions of Jews, they all come from the root souls of 600,000. This number is always consistent in the supernal sphere. It never grows or shrinks. It never changes even a hair's breadth. So while it changes in reality of this world based on all the different, sparks that come from each soul, in its root form, in its core form, that number never changes. However, these 600 root souls can produce many sparks, each one of which is a particular soul. For example, one who plants relatively few seeds can reap a great bounty. Similarly, many branches emerge from a single root. In the same way, many sparks can differentiate from a single root soul. I'm not sure why he brings the planting example versus a flame example, because a flame example, which is souls compared to a flame, is able to light many candles. So I'm sure there's a reason. I just don't understand why the branches or planting seeds and creating many branches from one seed is one of the examples. But point is that you could have one of the 600,000 souls be a source for many souls. So this is why there can be countless souls. So now, and he goes on. So the heavenly reality does not always translate accurately to the earthly plane because of the disconnect, because we have free choice and we have a choice to be engaged in more materialistic things, which means every time we do that, we draw the physical world further from the spiritual worlds. So the number of souls on earth can be greater or fewer than the number of root souls in heaven, depending on how the root souls are channeled into the earthly plane. So now we have the Rebbe. Sorry, I mixed up the commentary's name Menachem. So this provides insight into Talmudic healing remedies. The Rebbe says like this: our bodily experiences, such as eating and healing, devolve from our soul's spiritual nourishment and healing. So in other words, just like you have to be healthy physically and you have to eat healthy and you have to do things, exercise and do things that make your body healthy, it's actually a commandment from God. You also have to do that with your soul. And when your soul and body are in sync and harmony, you're more healthy. Mental health, for example, or certain elements of mental health, when somebody's soul is not in sync with their body, whether they're lacking purpose or lacking validity or lacking confidence or whatever else might be, that is coming from a gap in the soul. So the soul and the body have to be in sync for a person to be healthy. So when the Torah presents healing instructions and remedies that are intended as they are intended as heavenly remedies. In other words, they exist in the spiritual sphere. They exist in the spiritual worlds. This means that first and foremost, they are spiritual remedies. The plants cited in the Talmud point to a spiritual entity that we can't decipher. We don't even know what the plant is. After that, as an outcome and outgrowth of their original meaning, the spiritual remedies devolve and translate into physical remedies. And the Torah alludes secondarily to the lower sphere. So first and foremost, the Torah is talking about what exists in the spiritual worlds. And then we try to decipher it and understand it in this physical world. The spiritual remedies are eternal and unchanging. They always heal and benefit the spiritual entities, such as angels and souls. So in other words, the spiritual, whatever that vegetable was in the spiritual world, can heal some angels. And their initial spiritual iteration. The Talmudic remedies always provide spiritual nourishment and health for our souls. The Talmudic remedies are unchanging in this realm, in the spiritual realm. However, in the physical realm, in our reality, that's when, if there's a disconnect between the spiritual and the physical worlds, then it doesn't always translate. But it doesn't mean the Torah is not timeless. It means that we are not timeless, and therefore we're out of sync with what really is meant to be. It's like the metaphor of the couple and family that was imprisoned by the landowner for not paying their rent, and they were sent into a dungeon. And other families were sent in there, and they were never released. And their children would get married, and then the children had children, and you had grandchildren growing up in the dungeon, and they thought that was the whole world. They didn't know there was a whole world out, beyond that. So the more and more we sink into this physical world, we forget there's a whole spiritual world out there that is powering and infusing our world with energy. But the further we are from it, the further we're able to appreciate it, and therefore it doesn't always manifest. The spiritual remedies or the spiritual existences don't always manifest into the physical reality of our world. So when the soul's spiritual remedies devolve and translate to physical objects such as plants, they can change, because it could be a disconnect. When our behavior is meritorious and our lower sphere is perfectly aligned with the higher sphere, the spiritual remedies in heaven translate correctly into the earthly physical realm. The plants and roots identified in the Talmud have healing powers at such times. However, when the lower world descends and becomes misaligned with the higher sphere, the healing power of spiritual spheres do not translate fully into the plants and roots of the lower sphere. Therefore, these remedies lose their ability to heal the physical body. At such times, the only application of these remedies is in the higher sphere, where the spiritual parallels of these plants continue to heal the soul. So ultimately, it's not the fact that the Torah is not timeless. If something doesn't work, it doesn't mean the Torah is wrong or only applicable to a certain time. It means we are out of sync with the Torah. We are out of sync with the spiritual worlds, which the Torah is referring to, and our physical world is disconnected. A good example that I read was, when you travel abroad, let's say you go to Europe, right? So you have your cell phone charger or your laptop charger, and you go to Europe, and you see that the plugs are different. There's two little holes there instead of the 3-prong or 2-prong, whatever we have. It's also 220 volts versus the 110 volt. So you obviously can't plug in. So do you say that your laptop is broken? Do you say your cell phone is broken, or that nothing matters anymore? No, you're just in a different place. And in this place, you have to connect in a different source of energy. So the idea is that in order for us to receive the energy from the spiritual worlds, we have to be aligned with the spiritual worlds. And the further, as a society, as a nation, as a world, that we hide God's existence, the harder it is for us to be aligned with the spiritual worlds. But it doesn't take away from its legitimacy and from the truth of it and the timelessness of it, which is the fact that the Torah is timeless and everything in the Torah is forever. And never going to be rewritten, and it's always going to be applicable in some world. And when Mashiach comes, we'll actually be able to merit seeing it in both worlds and being able to appreciate and the value and everything that it brings. So let's just read this to help us recap. The Talmudic remedies are not just physical; they reflect spiritual realities. In an era when the physical and spiritual were aligned, these remedies worked. But as we became spiritually misaligned, they ceased to be effective. Not because they changed, but because we did. It's our fault, not the Torah's fault. So now the Rebbe goes on to say, what does this mean for us practically? So there are two ways to study Torah. One, as it is understood in this world, the revealed dimension of Torah, the legal, the halacha, basically just studying how we need to live and behave, which is totally fine. B, as it is understood in the higher sphere. The Torah's inner dimension as the soul studies in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden. The higher dimension comprises of two areas of study. One, study of the inner aspects of the reasons of the mitzvahs, in other words, the deeper meaning of why we do this mitzvah and the law. And two, study of the celestial and spiritual worlds in the singular, all-encompassing existence of Hashem. Basically, to understand how God is everything and there's nothing outside of God. So, though we are primarily charged to study the revealed dimension of Torah, and formulate halachic rulings, because we need to know how to live using our finite mortal minds. The Torah's primary thrust in the supernal sphere. The Torah's primary thrust is in the supernal spheres. We can only grasp the Torah's inner essence when we study its inner dimension. Doing so will enlighten and vitalize our study of its outer dimension, the Talmud and Jewish law, to which Torah alludes to only secondarily. Secondarily. So here's what I want to stress, and there's still more to this text. So 1 second. Until this enables us to feel, not just believe, that every word of the Torah, as it is understood on the earthly realm, vested in its world's physical garments, is wisdom and desire of divine. So what I want to stress here, and this is how we're going to end this class, is, there are many people who like to say, study this part of Torah because it's more important, or this part of Torah is more authentic or more real. And that's wrong, because every part of Torah is given by God, and in fact, it says to study the part of Torah that you most enjoy, because that is what you're gonna be most attracted to and most connected to, and want to learn more of. But at the same time, there's a value in studying the deeper meaning of Torah, the deeper meaning of the mitzvah. So, for example, we talked about tefillin, right? Or if you want to talk about Shabbat candles, you want to talk about giving charity, or you want to talk about Shabbat or any of the other mitzvahs or kosher. So you could learn about how to fulfill that mitzvah, which is very important. But you also need to learn the deeper meaning of why we do that mitzvah, what's happening when we do this mitzvah, learning about the influence and the impact that we're having in the spiritual world and the physical world, and why, if we forget to say Shema once in the morning, what's going to happen, that we're going to miss the divine light from the spiritual world coming down to this world. Or if we miss an opportunity to give charity to a person in need, we're going to miss the opportunity to connect area of godliness that was waiting, that was given to you to bring godliness into the world. And by studying the deeper meanings of Torah and the essence of Torah, it will enlighten every other part, every mitzvah that you do, and it will bring life to it. So when you shake the lulav and esrog, or you eat matzah, or you hear the Ten Commandments on Shavuos, you'll understand and you'll have an excitement for the fact of what you're accomplishing by doing this mitzvah, which is why it's so important not just to study how to do the mitzvah, but it's also important to study why we do the mitzvah and what's happening, what's the deeper meaning behind the actions that we take, and that is found in the study of Chassidus. So this is my plug that everyone should try and make a point to include study of Chassidus in their Torah studies and in their knowledge base, because it will inspire everything else that you study. Let us hope that when we receive the Torah on Monday, for the 3,338th time, I believe, it's as if it's brand new. Hashem is giving it to us once again, and may it be in a way that we actually understand it, reveal it, and are able to connect with it. How much more so if it's done in a way where with Mashiach being revealed and being able to experience it together with Mashiach. So thank you all so much for being here and for joining us. Shabbat Shalom, and of course, a happy and healthy Shavuot.